Hello, I'm Hayley Jarick, CEO of the Supply Chain Sustainability School. This episode of the People Planet Profit podcast was recorded as part of a video series. In this theoretical integrated design forum, architects, engineers, material suppliers, builders, and facility managers tell us things they wish the others knew about sustainable properties. We hope you enjoy. Hi, Jenny. Thanks for joining us today. I wonder if you can kick off with just letting us know what you do and what do you do and who you work for.
Hi, Hayley. Thanks for inviting me. Actually, it's a real privilege. So I own a facility management business called Melbourne Building Management, and it's been running for 9.5 years now. And we mainly focus on residential buildings. So we have around 43 buildings across Melbourne, metropolitan Melbourne, the suburbs of Melbourne, and we've got about 80 staff now on our books who work in the building. So we employ building managers to work on site. And like facility managers, we're there to look after the asset of the building. We look after all the common property. We look after the machinery and equipment. We look after things like pools and gyms and spas, but also, car gates, the air conditioning, hot water and cold water. But in addition to doing all of that, we also do a lot of customer service. So in our role as residential apartment managers, we end up working with the residents every day. We might be doing bookings with them. We might be helping them move in and out of the building. We might be doing inductions with them if they're new to apartment buildings, just to show them how the building works. We help them with booking common property and pretty much any other of the challenges that face owners corporations. So if they've got challenges with their neighbours being noisy, or the local dog, or pretty much anything you can possibly think of that happens in an apartment building, we're right there on the front line to help them out with it.
Awesome. So I can imagine that most people who are anyone who's ever lived in an apartment complex knows exactly what you do.
Yeah, yes,
and
exactly.
it's probably experienced it from the other point of view. And for those that have not had that pleasure, you can I think you've given a really good summary of the life in the, on the other side of what makes everything function and happen properly. And I suppose one of the joys of what you do is that, if nobody ever hears from you or sees from you, it means you're doing everything perfectly and and happily, and they're just coming to you with all the joyous things like, how do I book the pool? And none of the problems that get around other areas. So thanks for joining us today, because I think that's kind of, you're perfectly placed to come at this from, and I know we've had these conversations as well, of when we're linking with people through the entire construction supply chain, you sort of get lumped at the end of it with all of the legacies of the decisions that were made through the design, construction and the build, and then you're left to sort of figure out things at the end of the day as to the practical application and the operations of construction and building assets. So I'm going to ask you sort of 4 questions, and they're very similar, but I want to kick off with what are 3 things that you think that facility managers wish that architects knew about sustainable properties?
So it's a great question, because there's probably about 300 things that I'd actually love to tell architects about sustainable buildings. Probably the first one is that any sustainability, anything that's put into a building to be sustainable, needs to be able to be managed. So, and what I mean by that is that it's all very well to have, a cascading garden that goes down, 7 flights of the building on the outside. They're absolutely beautiful to look at, but the cost of maintaining, I think, I hope you know what I'm talking about, but the gardens, the vertical walls that they often put on buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. Internally and externally. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when they put them on the external buildings, they're amazing. And I totally love them because, they're contributing to the plant life of the buildings and they look wonderful. And, there's just so many reasons why having plants in your buildings is a fantastic idea. But for an owner's corporation, the cost of maintaining one of them is just astronomical. I've seen one that's about 6 floors high, and I was told that the cost of maintaining it was between $40,000 and $50,000 a year. And that's something that is, within their owner's corporation budget. So every residential apartment person has to then, find that extra money within their owner's corporation fees to pay for that. So having plants in buildings is so important, I think, and making sure that there's garden areas are so important. But those garden areas really need to be, well, they need to be sustainable in their own right. Putting native Australian plants in so that they're low maintenance and they're cost effective, that they don't need a huge amount of watering. A lot of the problems that we have from plants, particularly in buildings, is where they're on podium levels, often the planter boxes will leak. So that then causes a whole list of other issues that we then have to deal with. And again, it goes back to plants are so important to have in the environment, in any environment where we live, but how are they maintained? And what's the cost of that into the long term? Putting something in that looks amazing. We had one building where they put a palm in that came down from Queensland. It was gorgeous. It probably cost a lot of money to get it there, had to be winched up 2 levels to put it in. But because it came from Queensland in July into Melbourne, it died because it was too cold. And, it just didn't survive the experience of the change. Architecturally, it looked incredible, but what we need in apartment buildings is things that we can, that we can keep, that we can continue to look after, but that are going to cope with the harsh conditions that, ultimately apartment living is. So that's one. Thinking about the materials that are used in buildings is a second one that I get really passionate about, and the reason for that is that there's we have a lot of rooftop gardens, which again are beautiful places to be, with barbecues and outdoor areas and places that they can sit. But there is a real thing for putting rocks in rooftop gardens. And while they make sense because they don't tend to blow away, the greatest problem that we then have is if we have apartment buildings full of kids or even young adults, that they use the outdoor roof areas for their parties and they've got lots of people around, rocks become really easy weapons. And having rocks thrown off the 6th or 7th or the 27th floor of an apartment building is obviously actually a really quite a scary and sometimes dangerous thing. And I've had so many people tell me that, well, they're just rocks and they could be anywhere. And that's true. But putting things into apartment buildings, you have to think about how people are going to use that area. You have to think about what might happen in that area that, that then might encourage people to lift rocks up. I mean, we had one person shooting golf balls off the top of a building once, which was quite entertaining. And we obviously had to shut that down. But rocks can be the same sort of thing. And giving people projectiles tends to just give them a reason to hurl them off the building. I don't want to be a soothsayer, like it's not all bad, but it's just an example of where materials that can seem really inane in one circumstance can actually become really problematic in another. Putting rocks down in a garden might be fantastic, but maybe then just put a wire type of screen over it so that then they can't then be taken out of the garden. Maybe it's just a really simple thing like that needs to be done just to help maintain it into the future and make it not a challenge.
Oh, absolutely. I think you may as well be putting sort of neon paint on every single rock that says, pick me up and play with me, to any child that goes to top of that roof, right?
Yeah, or early 20s person that's got a couple of drinks in them. I think it's a great idea, see if they can hit the tree across the road. Yep. Or doesn't, or, and that's the thing that we found in all of our apartment buildings. One of the things that we would love architects to think about is, it might look amazing. And it's so, and probably my third one, and like I said, I've got at least 300. So if anyone wants to ask me further in the future, please do. My third one would be, with the architecture is the interior design. We have the most amazing building that has won all of these incredible awards for its design and for its interior design. And but what it does have is it has very, very special finishes. So things like pressed plaster or pressed concrete. I think in one building we've got pressed plaster, which is beautiful. It's lovely to look at. It's got a great finish on it. In a decorated space, it's very homely and it makes people feel very comfortable. But they put it into a lounge area that's often used for birthday parties. So what happens then is that everyone comes in with their streamers and their balloons, and they use sticky tape and blue tack, and they stick it all over the pressed plaster. And as you can imagine, it doesn't go very well because it's really hard to get off. And then if you damage the pressed plaster, it's impossible to fix because you actually need to take strips of it out, put new strips back in. So while it won an award for looking beautiful prior to people moving into it, it probably wouldn't win the award for longevity. And how is it going to be maintained into the future? If we're looking at our buildings lasting for 25 or 30 years, there's a good chance that really, really high-end finishes that need very particular application to clean them and to, you know, to fix them are not going to end up looking that fantastic, you know, into the future. And will then, that means that the owners corporation will then be looking at ways of changing it out or having to upgrade it. And obviously that involves a cost. So I think there's actually a lot of things that architects really can do to make our lives a lot easier. Even if it's just having a conversation with us, to be honest, at the start, you know, what do you think about this incredibly glass, shiny thing that looks beautiful? Just so that we can explain to them how people might use it in the future, because, you know, given the experiences that we've had.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. And I think that I know that the architects Declare movement held a webinar not long ago on integrated design, and actually getting everybody through the stakeholder groups together in the room at the start of the project to sort of really flesh out those issues. And I think that process of integrated design would actually sort of, you know, you like you said, it's having those conversations really early on in the piece to say, looks great, it might have great sustainability credentials, it might, you know, all of those wonderful things. But if you're replacing it every second weekend because, you know, someone's put sticky tape on it again, then it kind of really defeats the purpose from a life cycle perspective point of view of all of the great things you're trying to do, either aesthetically or sustainability related metrics or anything else that goes into that. And I know that we'll definitely have to have that list of 300 things, and we can expand that in future. But before, so that was 3 very good things for architects. Are there any engineering issues? So what are 3 things that you facility managers wish that engineers knew about properties?
Engineering is interesting for us because it's probably a little bit beyond the scope of the things that we manage in a day-to-day experience, unless it's things like noise. So one of the things that there's a tower in the city that I've spoken to just recently. It's not one that we manage, but one of the challenges that they have in their building is noise. And the noise is with regards to engineering, because it's actually got to do with the way the tower has been built. And it's a particular, I think it's like there's a wind tunnel that runs through usually waste chutes go through the center of the core. So things like lifts and waste chutes tend to be, you know, not always, but tend to sit in the core of the building. And often the buildings are built around it. This one's got to do with one of the ways that the waste chute was constructed, so that when it gets windy, there's the waste chute's like impacting, and I don't know I'm not an engineer, so I don't know the technical details, but the chute's actually impacting on the building in some way, shape or form, and it causes a lot of noise. And obviously in a commercial building, perhaps where you've got people there, you know, 9 to 5 in the daytime, a little bit of noise from wind is not going to be too much of an issue. They could drown it out with headphones, etc. But if you're trying to sleep in an apartment that's directly impacted by noise caused by, you know, a flawed engineering design, then that's a really, really challenging thing, particularly because they're hard to fix. Like there's really no way that you can go and strip the whole of the core of a building out and re-put it in, so that, you know, to fix a noise issue. So it's just being, I suppose, in a way, particularly in apartment buildings, being quite specific as to understanding what the impacts of any little change is going to be on people that live in the building later on.
Yeah, I think that's a really key one. It's, like you said, it's just kind of, it's a different ball game when you're sort of talking commercial daytime applications. They're usually pretty noisy during the day. They've got other stuff going on, but at nighttime, you're going to hear every little creak. So it's really sort of making sure that's it. Do you have any other tips for engineers, or would you like to move on to material suppliers?
No, I probably don't have any engineering ones just off the top of my head, but I'll think about them, and if I have some more, I'll come back to you, I promise.
It's like, no, we'll just add them to the list of the 300 architectural ones that we can definitely
we can do that. Yep.
All right, so let's talk about facility manager tips for material suppliers then. What do you wish they knew about buildings?
Yeah, material supplies. It goes back to one of the ones that I said about the architect in the beginning. I think materials that are supplied into building they actually have to be really hard wearing, and there has to be a real understanding of what the areas are going to be used for. So putting in, you know, a beautiful plush carpet into an area where pools are going to be, where there's a pool and a spa and a sauna, so that people are coming out of those things and walking straight across your beautiful plush carpets is just really, it's not a great idea. And understanding that, the areas within a building where there's going to be a great deal more wear. So carpets are a perfect example. Some of the best buildings I've seen have actually had tiles in the foyer areas of where the lifts are, and then the carpets in the corridors actually extend out from the tiled area right in front of the lift. Because ultimately, lift areas, sitting right in front of lift areas, that's where you're going to get the most traffic. And so it makes sense to put something that's really, really hard wearing right in front of those areas where you're going to get the most traffic, and then have the carpets further out, so that they're not getting as worn as quickly and having to be replaced as often. But it's also understanding things like, lining lifts, and lifts just came to mind, but lining lifts with really fragile, a really fragile material doesn't then lend itself to helping people move in and out. Because when people are moving their furniture in and out of a building, the only way that they can get their items to their apartment is up and down the lift. So obviously, if you've got materials that are really soft and that they scratch easily, and we've had one lift that's been lined with timber where they were really badly damaged, even just by things like bikes being put in the lift or prams, dogs coming to the lift and, scratch it with their feet or whatever. Those are the sorts of, I think for a materials person, and I'm actually not even sure if it's their fault, to be honest, because I think often those materials are specified by perhaps the architects or people who are designing the building, but understanding, how surfaces need to be more hard wearing as opposed to beautiful. There's a real functionality needed in apartment buildings. I'm absolutely confident you can have both, but what happens is that they start beautiful, and if they don't wear well, then over a period of time they become really shabby, and so you sort of lose that sparkle that they once had. I suppose materials, material designers really need to be behind their products and understanding what their capability of their products are. So like, the cladding debate in apartment buildings now, I'm sure everyone knows about, is a real eye-opener in that regard. Bringing in materials from China, if you're going to supply material from China, you really do need to understand what the Australian standard is behind that material that you're bringing in. And I think that's where the cladding debates become such a problem, because there was a belief that the cladding that was being put on the outside of these buildings was within standard, and now it appears that it is not. And it's the cost to having to remove the cladding on buildings is astronomical, and it's all falling back on the apartment owners, which is really challenging for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think you're right there too, in terms of it's sort of that two-edged sword, right? You can create materials and then you can specify how they should be used, but you can't always guarantee that people are going to use them correctly. And at the same time, then if you're going to market a material for a particular purpose, then you should try and find something that's fit for purpose. And often the materials that are designed for increased durability might not be the cheapest option in the short term, to just whack it in and get the building released, but for the longevity and operation of that building, it is absolutely the best cost alternative to spend a little bit more money up front and have the life cycle costs reduced for people as they go in there. So that's something that's really sort of fitting as we get in there as well.
That's correct.
And like you said, sorry, go.
And I was just going to say, I think there really needs to be an understanding about that too, because there has to be there has to be a cost benefit in it. I think if you can demonstrate that a building has been built with really, beautiful but durable materials, and that's going to last, that it has a sustainability component to it, that it's going to last a lot longer, that things aren't going to have to be replaced as quickly, that the life cycle is extended out, that there has to then, I suppose what we need to then do is look to ways of educating apartment owners or people purchasing apartments to understand that there's a greater value to them in that and it is now. You can just see that in some of our really old buildings in the city that have just endured and still are looking like, fantastic, that the value has to be in having an apartment in a building like that, as opposed to something that's very new but actually isn't maintaining its you know, the materials aren't surviving the experience of being in a really high trafficked space, and that so many things do need to be changed out in them, that, you know, there's a cost comparative there. Yes, you've got to maintain your building into the future, but if it's built really well in the beginning, then obviously that long-term cost is going to be less.
Yeah, and I think we've touched on, we're going to jump to the next one then about builders. So I think that that's kind of the middleman between the architects, engineers, and the material suppliers, is who physically puts it in the space, and how they construct that. So do you have any, what are 3 things that you think you wish facility managers, that builders knew about sustainable buildings?
Yeah, like the architects, I've got about 100.
Yeah. 3.
Yeah, I'll try and find.
We'll get the list up.
I'm coming up with. I'm giving you long-winded answers too, probably. 3 things I wish builders knew. That the first thing is, moving people into a building while they're still building is really, really challenging. And so, if that's what's going to happen, they need to be prepared to work with us, because, you know, it's not an easy thing to do. That's probably not even an appropriate one. The first one is commission. If you've got sustainability things being put in your buildings, things like water tanks, solar systems, you know, small wind turbines, anything that's being put into the building, builders can be quite blasé about it, because they're, in their view, councils are making the buildings put them in to get their sustainability rating, and but they don't always get them up and running, because they don't believe that they're going to be used in the buildings. And so I think builders, there should be a real push by builders to actually make sure that any of those measures are in and operable prior to them then sort of, you know, going, oh yeah, here's the building, I'm going to hand it over to you. And my reason for saying that is because often, if those things aren't working at the point where the builders go, yeah, we're done, they're not ever commissioned. And it seemed to be a bit of there's a bit of a gap there, I feel, in an understanding around how good sustainable buildings can be. Like, you know, how there are so many things that can be done to certainly reduce costs and to reduce emissions, but they're not always actually proactively put in place or commissioned, and they're not always running at the point where the buildings are taken over by the facility management. Then often, if that's the case, the facility managers might not have the knowledge or the ability to get them up and running themselves. So that's the first one. If you've got sustainable things in your building, please make sure they're actually running at the point where you then hand the building over, so that the people that buy the apartments actually have the benefit of those things. My second one is steps in any area that you're going to move, like any area where you have to move furniture or equipment, or are a really, really bad idea. So there's been and the reason why I say this is to the builders and not the architects is because I know that, you know, in the building process, sometimes things have to change. You know, they'll get in there and they'll find that, you know, something, ultimately a ramp can't be put in an area because there's not enough fall, or there's not enough handrails or whatever. And so they'll make a decision to put a step in there instead. And I'll actually have this in one of our buildings, but they put a step in the loading bay. And having a step in a loading bay where you are moving furniture all the time and getting equipment into a building and having to move really heavy and really large things is just so difficult. Yeah. And it's one step. And I'm sure at the time the builders were like, it's just one step. But again, it's understanding what that cascade effect is that it has on this building once it's taken over and it's actually being managed. And I think that, again, like architects, builders could really do, you know, it wouldn't hurt them to have a conversation with a facility management company just to understand, you know, what some of the challenges are once you take a building over, because I think there's that real lack of connectivity between the two professions, to be honest. Yeah. Just here's a product, go use it, and that's fine. But then, you know, sometimes the challenges could just very easily have been just totally eradicated by the builder if they had just you know, had a conversation with someone about it in the first instance. And what's the other thing about builders? I don't know. All the builders that we've met have actually been really good. And again, it's one of those things where I think that there needs to be a cohesive conversation between architects, interior designs, designers, builders, material, because collectively all of those people contribute to what is going to be, what the building product is going to be. Oh, the one other thing is don't swap products out, because what I have actually heard of is where an architect has specified particular products in a building, you know, and I'm talking about materials in this case. I think I mentioned this before with the materials engineers, but you know, they specify particular materials because the architects see that those materials are going to do X, Y, Z. They might be easy to clean, they might be really durable, they might be really fitting for that area, but the builders can see a way around it. So they actually swap it out for something that's to what ends up to us looking to be an inferior product. And that can then, of course, make, you know, that just changes that conversation. It can make it really challenging to clean it, or it might not be durable, or it might not be fit for purpose.
Yep.
And there is an opportunity, I know, for builders to do that, and that can then cause some really, you know, rather large challenges for facility managers down the track.
Awesome. Well, I will come back to you, because I think we do need to get those 300 tips together and share them with architects, and at least put them out there in a much longer forum that we can sort of really get to. And I think it's one of those key things that I deal with dealing with the entire supply chain, is actually getting each part of that supply chain to communicate some of these issues so we can prevent them from happening in the future. So I will definitely get in contact with you, Jenny, and we'll get them all out there and see if we can promote them and talk about it through the different industry forums. But until then, thank you so much for joining me for this session, and look forward to our next chat.
Thank you, Hayley. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a total pleasure.